Welcome to the Open Adoption Project. This is episode 103. We're the Nelsons. I'm Lynette.
And I'm Sean. In today's episode, we answer the question, why open adoption? The day that this episode is being launched, Lynette and I will actually be speaking at the Utah Foster Care Annual Symposium, and we get to really hype up openness in adoption. We are going to be leading a panel discussion with 4 incredible adoptees that will share their perspective and how openness played a part in their experiences. And so we're super excited. If you're one who learned about us at the conference that will be happening that day, we hope that this episode just adds to the experience that you had.
Yes, so we're going to start off by diving into what exactly open adoption is. So the first time that the term open adoption was used, according to Merriam-Webster, was in 1973.
That's not that long ago.
Not really, but there's this common misconception that open adoption is like the new way of doing adoption.
That's right.
But most adoptions involved some level of openness up through the early to mid 1900s.
So what did that look like?
So, I mean, it was usually like a family would help out with another family who needed help taking care of their child, right? Or there were sometimes like apprenticeships back in the early days of the United States where it wasn't really adoption, but those sorts of situations where you knew where your biological family was, you knew what was going on. It didn't really become secretive until the early 1900s or mid 1900s.
Do we know why it became secretive?
I mean, I imagine there's a lot going on here, but there's this adoption worker named Georgia Tan, and she was super sketch and did some really, really bad stuff. She was a child trafficker, and she would like kidnap children from poor families and then have rich families pay a lot of money to adopt them. And it was child trafficking and kidnapping and super, super sketchy. But things became a lot more secretive. And I know that she played a part in that. Some of our adoption policies today remain from her. And she was trying to protect herself, right? And like protect this scammy way of doing adoption. And so that's one reason. I know there's others, like the rise of international adoptions,
right,
and like so many other things.
I have one thing just to interject really quick. So I think you just said something that made me think about this, but a lot of the adoption laws that exist right now were created with the benefit of the adoptive parent or the adoption agency as the focal point.
Yeah.
And today we really need to switch that so that it is a lot more adoptee focused.
It should be entirely adoptee focused, right? That should always be our goal and our mission.
Anyway, I know that was a tangent, but that's something that I feel passionately about. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a quick additional tangent. So a lot of adoption records are closed or sealed, right? This is a big talking point right now, helping adoptees have access to their original birth certificates. And that was something that started during Georgia Tan's era as well. And so yeah, just really important to advocate for these changes, but open adoption is not new, is the point. We're not going to dive any more into
You're good. So the misconception was that open adoption is new. However, that was really the case almost all the time until the early 1900s. But now, since like the 1970s...
I mean, that's when it first began, but yeah, it picked up more in like the late 80s, early 90s, that open adoption became more common. And so the definition, if you look it up in Merriam-Webster, of open adoption is an adoption that involves contact between biological and adoptive parents, and sometimes between biological parents and the adopted child. So it is a very, very loose definition. When we say...
Super loose.
Yeah, when we say open adoption, like amongst ourselves, we're talking about a lot more openness, definitely like the child having some kind of relationship or contact, right? But that is the dictionary definition.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm reflecting back to, and I know we've shared this on the podcast before, but so the first time we really considered what open adoption was and what that would mean to us, and without knowing, and without the adoptee being the focus, it can be a really scary thought. If you're really thinking about your own prerogative, and it's about you as an adoptive parent, open adoption can sound pretty scary.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so one of the important things we need to do first, I think, is shift our mindset and think about the child, not ourselves, right? We're thinking about what they need and how we can help.
Yeah. So we're going to look at some academic research. Don't worry, we're not going to be boring. But that will help us focus on the adoptee and look at two different aspects of adoption, both structural and communicative open adoption or openness. Do you want to maybe briefly describe what both of those are?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, we'll have some references in our show notes. If you want to look up any of these different studies, some of them are older, but they're really the groundwork that helps us understand open adoption as we know it today. So structural openness involves sharing biographical information. So there can be in-person contact with biological family. It can range from whatever. Like, it could be letters, it could be visits, it could be
But yeah, in
Zoom
some way
calls, but there's some
like,
kind of, there's contact information is shared, and there's some kind of contact there.
some type of connection between adoptive parents and biological parents, or adoptee and biological parents. And that could look different in different situations.
Yep. And then communicative openness, that involves more of the transparency and open dialogue regarding adoption within the adoptive and maybe also biological relationships, right? So in the adoptive family, there's a transparent, open conversation. You can ask questions, like the adopted child is comfortable and free to raise questions. It's not a taboo subject. There's an open dialogue there. And this could also translate over to relationships with birth family, right? Like comfortable asking questions about biological family and adoption. And yes.
Yeah. Great. So we have structural openness and communicative openness. And each adoptee is going to experience a variety, or kind of it's on a kind of a continuum in both of those, right? To how much structural openness they have, how much actual communication they have with their birth parents, and communicative openness, how much they're comfortable and able to talk about their feelings as an adoptee with their adoptive parents, with their biological parents, with others, that respected people in the community. So there's two different sides.
Yeah, so since the 1970s, structural openness in adoption has become a lot more common, especially in Western nations like the United States. But how common is it? That's a really hard question because there's not really straight data on that. But the National Council for Adoption, which is a nonprofit advocacy organization, they collect some data about private adoptions from each state since it's not collected federally or other ways. And according to them, about half to 2/3 of domestic infant adoptions incorporate some degree of openness, which is pretty low.
Yeah.
But then I've also found the number 90%, 95% for the amount of open adoptions.
Openness.
But those come from adoption agencies. I haven't been able to find a source for where they're getting that, so it's really hard to say.
And remembering that openness may mean that adoptive parents have the name of a birth parent, right?
Right.
That,
it might not be an actual contact.
Is open.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really hard to say exactly how many adoptions are open, but it's somewhere in that ballpark, that very big ballpark.
Half to 2/3 of a domestic adoption.
Or to 90% or 95%, right? But yeah, that can just vary across this large continuum. And then when we're looking at other kinds of adoption, like international adoption or adoptions from the child welfare system, like foster care, it's generally lower. So generally domestic infant adoptions are going to have higher rates of openness, whereas international adoption and foster care adoptions are going to have lower amounts of openness.
Yeah, like structural openness.
Yeah.
Typically what we're
and that's what we're talking about right now. Yeah. Because international adoptions, we might not know any information, right? Those can be tricky, and then child welfare placements can be challenging as well because of different situations.
So let's jump into, there's a lot of ins and outs of structural versus communicative openness. Let's dive into a little bit to why it actually matters, why openness actually matters.
Yeah. So there's some research by Brodzinsky from 2006 and Siegel and Smith from 2012 that indicates that open adoption is preferred over closed adoption because it promotes psychological well-being in adopted individuals.
So it's preferred for the sake of the adopted individual.
Yeah, and that it's better psychologically. And so there's these different levels of openness that we keep talking about, but research consistently supports that the practice of both the structural and communicative openness is beneficial to adopted people. So a study by Siegel in 2012 found that the knowledge of one's biological family, no matter how often the frequency is, fosters a sense of belonging within the adoptive family. That's huge.
Yeah, that is huge. I mean, with that, there's so many complexities in the nature of adoption. There are some risks to it, right?
I mean, yeah, right? It just is so challenging to talk about, right? Because we don't want to be looking at these risks from adoptive parent perspectives. Side. We need to be looking at it from adoptee needs and how we can best serve our children, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I recently read an article, I guess it was more of a letter, on a prominent adoption website from an adoptive parent to other adoptive parents talking about why openness is a bad thing, or why you should reconsider having openness. And almost every one of his claims was focused on his own feelings and not any concern toward really his child.
Which is tragic, right? But fortunately, these risks that we do see sometimes in open adoption are really heavily outweighed by the positive factors that open adoption can offer. It can mitigate so many of the challenges that adopted individuals can face, and it offers more support to adoptees.
Yeah.
And so it's really, really worth taking seriously and fostering as much openness as you can. And if you can't control the structural openness, say that the birth parents of your child don't want contact, you can still have an open dialogue. And that's the communicative openness. And that's really important.
Yeah, we'll dive into that a little bit more here in just a second. But structural openness, really, I mean, the definition of open adoption has changed a lot, like we mentioned, over the last several decades. Before the 2000s, a lot of the research that discussed open adoption referred to only structural adoption.
Which we can see now because, like, when I'm talking about open adoption, I'm usually default thinking about structural openness, right? Yeah. I think that's pretty common.
Yeah. So a structurally open adoption supports the adoptee's direct contact and relationship with the biological family members, right? And really can range from just the biographical information to in-person and like really close types of contact with biological family.
Yeah. And some earlier studies of structural openness showed that adoptees are not confused by having open adoption. It doesn't cause confusion. It does not cause lower self-esteem. And it actually increases self-esteem and causes a more whole sense of self.
Yeah. And I remember really early on, again, kind of as the naive new adoptive parent, thinking, well, is she going to call you mom and her birth mom? Like, what if she used that terminology? And that was a scary thing back then.
I
was so worried about how I was reacting to that. But we have 4 children that were adopted, but I'm thinking of my daughter's experience. In reality, she has 2 mothers, right?
Yeah, and 2 fathers.
Right? And in her reality, how she distinguishes what she calls us or them, and it's up to her and what feels right to her. Obviously, we have a culture in our home where we have different kind of norms, what we refer to birth parents as versus mom and dad here at home. But in reality, like she has 2 sets of parents. We have different roles, we have different responsibilities, but we're parents.
Yeah, we've talked about how we need to have this mindset shift where we're focusing more on the adopted individual. I think it's also important to focus more on the birth parents or the first parents, because that's a key part in forming these relationships. There are actually studies as well that show that adoptive parents demonstrate more empathy toward birth parents and toward their child. And they also feel like they have more secure relationships with their child when they have that structurally open adoption. And it's kind of a question to me of like, which comes first, right? Like, does the openness bring more of that empathy and connection, or does the empathy and connection bring more openness?
Right.
I imagine it's both. Like, it's a cycle that feeds itself.
So structural, we're going to kind of transition into communicative here, but they really do tie together. And as you were saying that, I was kind of thinking about, we have these relationships with birth families, and one of the things that we talk about a lot on the podcast is how we talk about them in our homes and with other people. And it's so vital and important that we see our children's birth families in the best light possible, because our children relate part of their identity to those individuals, their birth family. And so that kind of...
Well, they come from them. Yeah.
It's part of them, right? And so that kind of brings us to this thought of communicative adoption. How we talk about adoption with an adoptee, whether that's in our own homes or with other people, that is communicative adoption. How we're communicating about adoption.
Yeah, and that can really plays such a big role. Some research shows, I hesitate to say this because they're both so important, structural and communicative openness are both so vital, but research really does show that communicative openness is so important, and possibly a little bit more important than the structural openness, because that conversation is so important in developing a healthy identity and strong sense of self.
Well, and even as you say that, I think the more communicative openness we have in our home, it will naturally lead to some level of structural openness.
Or at least like encouragement of structural openness, right? Like if it's not possible, there's still like, because you're building empathy, right? It's this connection and fostering, like showing your child that you love all of them, you love their birth family. You're right. I think it's kind of a chicken and the egg, where they both are so important to each other. So there is some really cool research from Kohler, it's in 2002, that found that adolescent adoptees who felt like their family had more open communication with their birth family reported higher levels of trust toward their parents and felt less alienated from them, and reported better overall family functioning.
Yeah,
which
it's
intuitive,
really
but it's so important. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Brodzinsky in 2005 found that communicative openness may be a more important predictor of adoptee self-esteem than structural, kind of like you mentioned before.
That's really, what that's coming from. So, communicative openness is so important, and it's something that adoptive parents, you have complete control over, right? We really encourage structural openness. I feel like it is so important, but sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes we can't have the degree of openness that we'd like, but we can always have communicative openness. You can always have that open dialogue.
Yeah, and with technology the way that it is today, like our daughter's birth mother moved states halfway across the country, and we still have structural openness with or between them and between us and her. I mean, Marco Polo's been a great tool. We also see her parents, grandma and grandpa, that live not too far from us. So that structural openness is just really important too.
There's so many ways that you can maintain that structural openness.
Yeah. I just have to share this. So our daughter recently had a birthday, and we planned to go out to dinner for birthday. And because of other circumstances, friends weren't able to come. With the eclipse, actually, people were traveling, kind of funny. But in the end, it ended up being our immediate family, the six of us, Lynette's parents, and then two sets of unrelated biological...
One of our son's biological grandparents, but they're grandparents to all the kids. And then our daughter's birth mother's parents. And so those grandparents, they're her birth grandparents.
Yeah, so I was just sitting at this table, and the waitress actually took a picture for us, and I just looked at all of the support and love around that table. And then we were missing a lot of people in our open adoption family bush. It's not really a tree. But I just kind of sat there thinking, like, there's so much love here for that girl and the rest, and our three boys. Like, it was just awesome. And
it really is beautiful. It's amazing to see. Because I feel like all parents feel inadequate at times, or a lot of the time, but that extra support, it really benefits our children, and it benefits us as parents, and it's just amazing to see. So open adoption can really bless your family.
Yeah. So we support and want to foster as much communicative openness and structural openness for our adoptees' sake. Now, there are some practical things as adoptive parents that we have to do and know and think through, and some of that deals with maybe some of the fears that we have around open adoption. So we would like to consider a couple questions that we've heard and that we felt ourselves to some degree about openness and what it actually can look and feel like.
Yeah. So people often will ask how you can have a safe, structurally open adoption if there's any substance use or exposure or maybe some mental health challenges with the birth family.
Yeah, I think this starts with some really clear communication up front. Just hearkening back to that letter that I read from the adoptive father, he said something like,
we found this because it was one of the top things when we were searching for open adoption on the internet. Like, it was one of the very top.
It just hurts
it was
my
crazy.
Heart. But he said it was the perfect match. And then his reasons for it being perfect was that this particular expectant mother wasn't using drugs and didn't seem to have any emotional concerns. And there was no conversation about perfect match, meaning I have a strong relationship with this person and know that they're going to be a part of my child's life forever, and I know that we can navigate this together. There was nothing like that. It was just, again, about the adoptive parent getting what, quote unquote, he wanted in a child that wasn't exposed to drugs or potentially having hereditary emotional issues. And
that hurt my heart. That was heartbreaking.
It hurt my heart so bad.
But substance exposure is a real challenge in adoption. And honestly, the science is kind of hard to access, right? Because generally, children who are exposed to substances in utero, like, stay with their biological family, and it's really hard for researchers to know what is coming from environmental factors, what's from exposure in utero. And so that's really hard to know.
We do have a few resources on openadoptionproject.org from Dr. Jeremy Stone, who is an adoptive father, and he did do some research into, or at least presented some information for different types of substance use in utero and what potentially that could mean. So if you're interested or have concerns about that, go check that out on the website. But going kind of back, circling back to our question of, like, is it safe for the adoptee, and what happens if it's not a safe situation?
All right. So first of all, I think it's important to consider a scenario where, say that you decide it's not safe to have any contact at all, and down the road your child has a genetic predisposal toward addiction, and it's something you've never talked about. They have never seen someone struggle with it and overcome it, and it's going to be a lot harder, I think, without that background. And some studies do show that these different addictions and challenges can be hereditary.
Yeah. So there's a level of communicative adoption that communicative openness that needs to happen around some of those issues, where
in a compassionate way, right? We never talk
sure.
smack about birth parents, but
helping them understand that they may be predisposed to behaviors or health challenges, right, that are genetically passed down. So that's one side, but
and that they need to be extra cautious and vigilant.
Yeah. But the structural side, we have friends, and we've been involved in these conversations where up front, and this kind of where I tangent off to that the adoptive father, but up front you need to be really clear in your communication about what type of openness you want, what type of relationships you want. There are some boundaries that you need to set, and if you know that they have experience with with drug abuse or substance abuse, then upfront saying, we love you, we want you to be part of our family. When you're not clean, we don't want you in our home.
But have these really direct conversations about what expectations are, but also address it with compassion, right? Like, if this parent is having a hard time getting clean, they can still send a video for your child. It's okay, and you can let them see this video of birth moms saying how much they love them, or I don't know. Like, you can find ways to still connect and support them and show them love. And there is research that shows that connection is so important, especially in helping people heal from addictions. And so I think it's just so important to address this compassionately, to remember to keep it child-centric. And it's okay to have boundaries. We need to have boundaries.
Yeah.
We need to keep our kids safe, but we can also balance this with love and compassion, and we can find ways to make things.
Yeah. And I want to add a huge caveat here that this is one of the common questions that is asked about those that are struggling with addiction. By no means are we saying that the majority or even a big portion of birth parents struggle with this, right?
We're just addressing some common questions.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I would love to dispel that misconception.
So then there's also some struggles with social media that people have. Like, how do we navigate social media connections with birth family? Like, do we connect on social media? Do we interact? How do we feel if they're posting pictures of our child? It's their child too. Some people get upset if someone else refers to their child as my child, even though it's both of your child. So these are conversations to have, things to think about.
And a lot of these conversations need to happen before.
Yeah, before papers are signed. It's important. And if it's already, like, if you've already signed papers, it's not like it's too late. You can still have these conversations.
Right.
But I think it's really important to have them before papers are signed, if possible, so that you can be sure this is a good fit, so you can have everything out in the open. It's just so important to keep things ethical and above board.
Yeah, and one thing I thought about this, we have a lot of connections with lots of birth family, but with our youngest, his birth parents were connected on social media, and we use like Facebook Messenger we have a smaller group with just Lena and I and them, and we share fun updates and cute pictures and stuff like that. But we also have a group that has, her grandparents and mom and cousins,
way more family,
and a lot more that we also include and share information and updates with. And it's so fun because
it's a great tool.
And they just kind of pour on more love and kind of fawn over our kids, which is really fun.
So fun. Yeah, so one thing we've chatted about a little before in the past is that it can be really hard for birth parents to let you know when they might want more contact, when they're feeling like they need more, right?
Yeah.
And so we need to be sure that we're making it safe for them. We want to treat them the way we would want to be treated if our roles were reversed, right?
So this level of communicative openness that we have with
biological family members,
is really important. And we want people to feel safe. We want people to feel like they can share. Obviously, respect is really important here, but on both sides, we want people to share their feelings. And if we've created a scenario where that's not ideal, then there's going to be feelings of resentment and perhaps anger and frustration that will eventually come out in some way. And so we need to do what we can to avoid that.
Absolutely. All right, so hopefully by talking about some of these issues and similar issues, we can help assuage some of these concerns, and we can better understand how open adoption can help us through these challenges, how it's not really a burden or like a hurdle to cross, but how it can actually help us get through different struggles in adoption relationships. Yeah.
Any other frequently asked questions that we've heard that we might want to address?
Yeah. So we have heard quite a few people say that they felt pressured to have an open adoption because they were told or assumed that they wouldn't be able to have a placement, if they didn't say they're willing to have an open adoption.
And maybe some of that pressure is coming, or most of that pressure is coming from an adoption agency or
But that's
social
great,
workers.
And it's great that they're pushing open adoption, but these people don't understand what open adoption is, why it matters, and so they're agreeing to it, but not with their heart and not with this understanding.
They can get a baby.
Yeah. And so there's some research about this, and it's wild. This is from McDonald, 2011. So the way in which open adoption education is presented seems to really impact how openness is practiced within an adoptive family. So when adoptive parents choose to have higher structural openness because of an agency or a social worker prompting that, rather than choosing it for the well-being of the child, then they are significantly less likely to maintain that openness 2 years post-placement. So basically, it's less likely that they're going to stick to it if they don't feel that, for lack of a better word, conversion to open adoption.
Yeah. Hence, we're here. And we feel really passionately about this. We know for our children are in better places. And we've talked with so many adoptees on the podcast that have benefited so much from both of these types of openness that it just kind of boggles my mind that it's not, that it's, in some cases, it's not even considered.
Right. It's really heartbreaking. And I think we've talked quite a bit on the podcast over the last few months about structural and communicative openness, but we realized we hadn't really done a deep dive into them. And so that's part of where this episode was coming from, also wanting to address some of these frequently asked questions. But it's so important, right? That we are, I feel like I'm quoting, I've never watched The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, guys, except for a couple of episodes a long time ago. And all I remember is they were always talking about being there for the right reasons. This is such a stupid tangent. But you need to adopt for the right reasons. And I feel like I'm quoting that stupid show now. But right reasons, right?
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of these, but adoption does not cure infertility. You will still be infertile if that is the reason that you're adopting. Emotionally, you have to deal with that. That one does not solve the other, right? Knowing that this child, this human, is connected biologically to other people and will most likely, from all of the interactions that we've had, have some level of curiosity, questions, concern about their origin story. It will come back to that, and it will, the picture will be painted of what actually happened.
Yeah.
And so if you do anything in an adoption process, whether that's an infant or later on in a child's life, it's coming if they're being adopted out of the foster care or welfare system, anything that is going to be painted badly of you in the experience, you need to think about your actions.
Imagine that your child will have access to
everything
that you've ever said or done. And I don't know, maybe they will. Maybe we'll have time travel in a few years. But no, we want to make sure that we're practicing ethically. We want to make sure that we won't have these embarrassments and regrets about our ethical conduct in adoption, because it really matters.
And that makes adopting a lot more work for adoptive parents.
It is.
If you're wanting the easy way out and you're trying to say, okay,
adopting
I'll do
should never
adoption,
be the easy way out.
Yeah. Just so that you're pacifying caseworkers or an adoption agency, that is not the right reason to do an open adoption. But again, we feel really passionately
for the bit of a soapbox,
for the adoptee's sake, that openness is the best.
And the research really shows it, as we've been talking about, right? The open adoption is so important because it helps adoptees, and that should be our entire purpose and our goal.
Yeah.
So. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening to us rant a little bit.
We're a little soapboxy about this because we really care. And so our invitation to you, no matter who you are in the adoption constellation, is to foster openness, structural openness or communicative openness for the adoptee's sake, right? We want to do both, and as much as we can for the sake of our children.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap up this episode of the Open Adoption Project, but we'll be back in a couple of weeks with more content. And we're really grateful you're here listening to us soapbox.
And we just want to remind you that Lynette recently published the Openness Guide for Prospective Adoptive Parents. This really is kind of the what you should know about open adoption as you're going into it. The reason that we published this guide, Lynette started this probably 2+ years ago.
It's been a while, yeah.
The reason that we came out and published it now is that so we can support the podcasts moving forward, right? it takes a lot of time. There's licenses and, other fees that go into producing the content. People helping us out, and so the proceeds that we get
it goes right back to the podcast.
Go right back to the podcast. And if it ever gets to the point where there's more than the podcast needs, it's going to go into further helping educate adoptive parents or future adoptive parents, the adoption community at large, so that we can foster the best situations for all of our adoptees in our lives.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, and we'll be back soon.